All right, so today we're diving into a book that's a little different. Winning is for Losers by Bill Drummond. It's not your typical autobiography.
Yeah, it's more like a puzzle box of thoughts.
Exactly. It's a collection of these official Bill Drummond biogs for 2024. Little snippets of his life seen through different lenses. But here's the thing, running through all of it. Drummond calls himself a lifelong rebel, but he's constantly pushing back against the idea of rebellion.
Yeah, there's a lot of contradiction there.
Absolutely.
Eh,
And that's what we're going to unpack today. This tension between rebellion conformity and this constant questioning of, well, everything.
It starts early, too. You see this rebellious streak even in his childhood, like his aversion to the Cub Scout motto, be prepared.
Right. Like who rejects being prepared on purpose?
Yeah.
It's almost like he was rebelling against the very idea of rules.
It's like a playful jab at authority, just poking fun at expectations. And then as a teenager, it gets even more interesting. He refuses to wear Levi's only Wranglers.
And forget about bands with pictures on their album covers. No smiling for photos either. It's like he's going out of his way to be different, even if it seems a little random.
It's definitely a pattern, though, this resistance to anything mainstream, this need to stand apart.
And then we get to 1972, a pivotal year for him. He's rebelling against television, but then he sees David Bowie performing Starman on Top of the Pops.
And that changes everything.
Right. Talk about a paradox. He's completely captivated by Bowie, this ultimate rock star, but then he comes out with that infamous statement, all rock stars should be shot.
Almost like he saw something in Bowie that he both admired and feared, that charisma, the power of the persona. It's like it triggered this rejection of the very thing that drew him in.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So we have Bowie sparking this rejection of celebrity. But what about the rejection of choice?
Yeah.
Fast forward to 1992, and we find Drummond in a newly opened Safeway supermarket, just completely overwhelmed by all the options. And it triggers what he calls his supermarket epiphany.
He describes it as a rebellion against choice itself. Like he's standing there surrounded by all these products. And he realizes this freedom of choice is actually an illusion, a form of control disguised as liberation.
It makes you think about our lives today, right? We're bombarded with choices constantly, from what to buy to what to watch to who to be online. It's overwhelming, and it makes you wonder, are we really in control or are we just being manipulated by the system that wants us to keep consuming?
And then there's this added layer of complexity. He starts to grapple with his own privilege as a white male. He realizes he occupies a position of power in society, and he starts to examine what that means.
So how do you rebel against your own power? I mean, that seems almost impossible.
Well, he describes these almost childlike attempts to diminish himself, blackening his face as a kid, wearing his mother's clothes, his lifelong habit of stooping to appear shorter. It's like he's trying to physically minimize himself to escape these power dynamics that are tied to his identity.
It's kind of heartbreaking, isn't it? This attempt to reject something so deeply ingrained. It really raises some questions about unconscious bias and the limits of individual rebellion.
Yeah, it really highlights that tension.
Right.
Wanting to dismantle these systems, but also benefiting from them. And as Drummond gets older, his rebellions start to focus on rejecting success and validation, those traditional markers of achievement.
Yeah, he pushes back against this idea of a cultural caste system, where certain types of art or music are seen as superior to others.
He really criticizes this hierarchy in the arts. Like there's this predetermined ranking of what's good and what's not, and he sees it as limiting creativity and just reinforcing those existing power structures.
And it's not just about good or bad art. It's about rejecting good taste altogether.
Yeah.
He argues that all music is equal, which is a pretty bold statement coming from someone so involved in the music industry.
It's like he's challenging us to really examine our own preferences.
Right.
Are our tastes truly our own, or are they shaped by these external forces, like trends or critics? Could embracing a wider range of music lead to a greater artistic appreciation?
It's a good point. It's like he's forcing us to question our assumptions about what we value and why. And this applies to everything, not just music, but books, art, even the way we categorize and rank artists.
And there's this fascinating thread of self-sabotage that runs through his actions. He rejects opportunities, burns bridges, almost seems to revel in his failures. It's like he's actively trying to avoid any kind of conventional success or recognition.
It's like by succeeding within the system he criticizes, he feels this sense of guilt or hypocrisy. So he deliberately undermines his achievements as a way of maintaining his integrity, or at least his sense of rebellion against the system.
Which brings us to a really crucial point in the book. He starts to reflect on his blood on his hands. He's talking about the Congo Wars, the exploitation of resources that fuel our technology. He's confronting the uncomfortable reality that even his seemingly insignificant actions are part of this larger system that perpetuates suffering and inequality.
Yeah, it's a heavy realization, especially for someone who spent his life rebelling against authority. It's like he's coming face to face with a new kind of authority, a moral imperative to acknowledge his complicity in the very systems he opposes.
And it leads us to the unique structure of the book itself. These official Bill Drummond biogs for 2024. Instead of a single definitive version of his life story, he offers us a kaleidoscope of perspectives.
Right. These biogs are created by others from excerpts of a longer piece he calls Bill Without a Cause. So we're getting these glimpses into how different people interpret his life and actions.
Some biogs focus on specific events, others on recurring themes. Some are straightforward, while others lean into the absurdity of his choices.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, hey, even my own life story is open to interpretation. There's no single truth, no definitive answer. And I think that's really powerful. It invites us to engage with his story actively, to draw our own conclusions.
Exactly. And this multiplicity of perspectives really mirrors the book's central theme. Life is messy and contradictory, and embracing those contradictions is maybe more honest than trying to present some polished, sanitized version of ourselves.
And what's really striking about these biogs are the little details,
Mm.
the sentences that capture Drummond's complex character. One biographer describes him as someone attracted to grayness, lives in the world of the trivial, has never known what he's talking about.
There's a lot to unpack in that statement. It's provocative, almost a caricature, but also incredibly insightful. And it plays into that self-deprecating humor that runs throughout the book.
Right, he doesn't shy away from his flaws or contradictions. He's not presenting himself as some guru or role model. He's just a guy trying to figure things out, make sense of his life, and maybe challenge us to do the same.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes Winning is for Losers such a compelling read. Drummond isn't offering these easy answers or solutions. He's inviting us to join him on this messy, contradictory journey of self-discovery, where rebellion and accountability are kind of intertwined.
So it's not about blindly following the crowd, but also not getting so caught up in rebelling that you lose sight of the bigger picture and your own impact.
Exactly. It's not about apathy or inaction. It's about being more conscious, more aware of the consequences of our choices, both the big ones and the small ones.
So where does that leave us then? What are we supposed to take away from all this deep dive into Bill Drummond and all his contradictions and self-sabotage?
I think the book really leaves us with more questions than answers, which is actually its strength. It challenges us to examine our own relationship with rebellion and conformity. What are we rebelling against? What are we conforming to? Are we just going along with things because it's easier? Or are we actively making choices that align with our values?
And maybe even more importantly, are we actually making a difference with our actions? Or are we just part of the problem, perpetuating the very systems we say we're against?
It's a tough question, and it leads to this final provocative question that Drummond seems to pose. Can true rebellion even exist in a world where everything is instantly commodified and categorized?
So if rebellion is always co-opted and turned into a product, can it still be a force for change?
Right. It's a question that feels so relevant today, especially with social media. It's easy to be outraged online, to signal our virtue through likes and shares. But does that translate into real-world change?
Or are we just feeding the algorithm, creating more content for a system that profits from our dissent?
Drummond doesn't give us any easy answers, but his journey suggests that maybe true rebellion in the 21st century requires a different approach.
So what might that look like?
Well, maybe it's less about those grand gestures and more about the small, everyday choices we make. Consuming less, supporting ethical businesses, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, challenging our own biases, building communities that prioritize values over profit.
So maybe rebellion isn't just about what we're against, but what we're for.
Exactly. And that true rebellion is an ongoing process, not a destination. It requires constant self-reflection, a willingness to challenge our own assumptions, and a commitment to acting in ways that align with our values, even when it's uncomfortable.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Winning is for Losers, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Drummond, with all his contradictions and self-awareness, might be onto something. He's not giving us a roadmap, but a challenge. A challenge to think critically, question our assumptions, and find our own ways of rebelling against the forces that try to define us.
And maybe, just maybe, in that process, we can create a world that's just a little bit more equitable and a little bit more free.